Okay, so thanks again for joining us today for this webinar on the theme on alternatives to tobacco, the rise of electronic nicotine devices and their clinical relevance. My name is Derek Noland, Community Liaison and one of BHWP's lead trainers in our Advanced Technique group curriculum and our Tobacco Treatment Specialist program. With me today is Jim Pavlik, and BHWP's Program and Policy Analyst, and another one of our lead trainers. So you can see the objectives for today. We will introduce ENDS products and what elements of their design may be cause for concern. We'll investigate whether ENDS are useful as cessation devices, and we'll differentiate first to third generation ENDS and the pod-based products such as Juul, and propose potentially clinical relevant information. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jim.
Great, thanks, Derek. I'm going to start by drawing a circle around the nature of the tobacco industry's immorality. If you've been to any tobacco-related training before, including any of BHWP's, if it talks even a little bit about the history of the industry or its targeted campaigns like Project Scum, the implication is that they are just simply ruthless murderers. But I think that conclusion warrants some clarification. The tobacco companies don't necessarily want people to die. There's more profit in living addicts than there are in dead ones. I hope that isn't interpreted as an apology for the lies of the industry. Many of the so-called harm reduction technologies they've invented, like filters and low-tar cigarettes, have been unequivocal failures. As such, there's concern whether ENDS represents the harm reduction potential they seem to. Of course, the science is still developing on these products, and all I can really say on the veracity of the claims they're making is that those companies are facing a level of scrutiny that has been shaped by the revelations of previous attempts at obfuscation and misdirection. That doesn't mean they're telling the truth, of course, but I hope it means that we're all harder to fool. One thing we should keep in mind is that the introduction of smoking alternatives like Juul and others is that it's only the latest stage in an ongoing and never-ending process of evolution for tobacco, beginning with the arrival of Europeans to North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean. In this pre-Columbian period, there were only a couple of varieties of tobacco plant cured in only a handful of rudimentary ways, and the dominant forms of consumption were through pipes, cigars, inhalation, and drinking. Nevertheless, the arrival of Europeans introduced the whole world to the plant and its addictive alkaloid nicotine. But for Europeans, the primary means of consumption was smoking, primarily in pipes, but also in cigars. The invention of the cigarette rolling machine was a huge incentive to adopt cigarettes as the primary mode of consumption. But to truly harden this habit required both the invention of the match, which is a lighting source as reliable and portable as the cigarette itself, and new varieties of tobacco, more efficient at holding a smolder. Tobacco companies have continued to evolve these two elements, the sources of the heat and the nature of the tobacco. We are now entering a phase where we no longer use flame, and we no longer use leaves. It wasn't until after World War I, when soldiers were given cigarettes, that the so-called cigarette century really begins to take off. A rather underreported factor here was the deliberate association of women's suffrage to smoking, one of the first true public relations campaigns. This made cigarettes socially desirable for women. The first patent for an e-cigarette type product was filed in 1927, and the first one that really resembled what was eventually sold was in 1963. Rather quickly, between the 1920s and the 1960s, cigarettes became quite popular, crowding out most of the other alternatives. Beginning in the 1930s, when the link between smoking and lung cancer first became noticed, cigarette companies began looking for addictive products that didn't kill their consumers. Wicks Brothers introduced filters for the Du Maurier brand in 1930, a design picked up for Viceroys in the United States in 1935. In the 1950s and 60s, the link became scientifically undeniable, and the push for a safer product sped up. Filters were added to Kent's in 1952, quote-unquote expanded tobacco blends, which reduced the actual volume of tobacco in the cigarette, were introduced in the 1960s. American Tobacco introduced low-tar Carltons in 1964, the same year the Surgeon General officially linked smoking to both lung cancer and heart disease. Ventilation holes were introduced to filters right around the same time that Marlboro Lights hit the shelves in 1971, and the first heat not burn products were introduced in the 1990s. ENDS products began receiving a lot of public attention in roughly 2011 due to the rapid growth of their popularity. Between 2011 and 2015, conventional cigarette sales essentially plateaued, while ENDS product sales climbed by about 600%. This rapid rise, especially from 2011 to 2014, generated many headlines that ENDS would soon completely overtake the conventional cigarette market. But there was some indication even then that this growth rate had slowed, with cigarette sales still outpacing ENDS by something like 80 to 1. Similarly, beginning in the fall of 2017, the world began noticing Juul, specifically due to what seemed like their sudden, unanticipated arrival and their equally sudden popularity. Within about 2 years of their introduction, they had captured over 70% of the ENDS market share. And note I said ENDS market share. Most of their growth came from cannibalizing business from other ENDS brands. ENDS themselves still represent a small portion of all nicotine-containing products used. It could be the case that the technological advancement represented by the release of Juul is the opening move in the true death of the cigarette. So here we see the true shape of the cigarette century. We can identify 3 ages of tobacco use, really nothing more than a pre-cigarette moment and a post-cigarette moment, with the cigarette moment in between. It's worth pointing out that cigarette alternatives have always existed. First, pipes, cigars, and smokeless were those alternatives. And since at least the 1920s, we've seen experimentation with, and finally the release of e-cigarettes, heat-not-burn products, and others. Since the 1990s, tobacco companies have been pushing hard into these new alternative technologies. Many of the nicotine replacement therapies we have now were initially developed as smoking alternatives, or at least the relevant technological advancements are pretty similar. Snus was the first big push in the direction of turning our backs on cigarettes. Snus is to Sweden, where it was developed, as cigarettes are to us, which is to say that right around 80% of all tobacco use in this country is cigarettes and cigarettes only. And that is how much snus is used in Sweden. Of course, snus is not the only smoking alternative. In recent years, we've seen Swedish Match, snus's manufacturer, and Philip Morris attempt to persuade the FDA to grandfather in both snus and IQOS as harm reduction products. Since 2003, e-cigarettes have been on the market, and the current makers of Juul founded their company in 2004. With smokeless tobacco products, pipes, and cigars still available and relatively popular, and the introduction of heat-not-burn technology, vaporized products, and leafless nicotine salt pouches, we are almost certainly at the beginning stages of a large cohort effect. Barring significant policy and regulatory changes, the majority of established smokers will either one day move to abstinence or take their habit to the grave. But current young people use tobacco primarily through these alternatives, and recent data suggests they are doing so in very large, very concerning figures. As they become adults, they will likely bring these particular habits with them, changing the character of our national addiction to nicotine. So this is what ENDS use looked like right before Juul hit the market. We'll use this as a starting place for understanding the information that Derek is about to present. We'll return to this chart again when we try to understand what the future of treating tobacco dependence may turn out to look like. So on the left of the dotted line, you'll see that ENDS use still represents a very small portion of the overall adult population. And then to the right of that dotted line, you see 4 classes of ENDS users defined by their relationship to smoking. You see current cigarette smokers, recent former cigarette smokers, that is, they quit within the last 12 months. Long-term former smokers have been quit for over a year, and then finally never smokers, being a very small percentage of adult use of ENDS products. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Derek.
Okay, thank you, Jim. So let's look further at these topics. I'm going to start today by defining the products and looking at how they're rendered. So you'll see here that we're using the term ENDS. You've probably already noticed that. The FDA and government often uses the term e-cigarettes, and of course in common parlance that term is commonly used as well. However, technically that only refers to one specific type, and therefore we do prefer the ENDS term, which stands for Electronic Nicotine Delivery Systems. This term is clear as it does cover all the different types of products within this realm, and therefore it can be a better choice of words when we're trying to be as clear as we can in our policies and our approaches to combating them or their use. Okay, so let's begin by reviewing this family of products that is entailed by the ENDS term. You can see there's a lot of commonalities between them. For one, they have a holding spot for a solution that contains nicotine. Each type of product also has some sort of heating device, which can turn that solution into an inhalable aerosol. We'll talk more about that aerosol term in a little bit. They also have a powering device, a battery of sorts, in order to make that happen. You can see that the holding area contains either a cartridge, which is not refillable and therefore has to be replaced from time to time, or a tank which can be refilled and reused. The heater is often called an atomizer or a vaporizer, and sometimes the cartridge and atomizers can be combined into one device, at which point it would be called a cartomizer. Your typical cartomizer might have about 300 puffs, which is roughly equivalent to maybe 20 or 30 cigarettes. So when we put all this together, we come up with the shorter definition that you see here, a battery-powered device that provides inhaled doses of nicotine. It's also important to note that the cartridges contain e-juice, and they can be purchased at varying strengths. One of the more common ones is the 1.8% strength, or 18 milligrams of nicotine, and those are typically marketed as being one cigarette per about 10 puffs on the device. However, they do come in different strengths, and it's important to note that it's not necessarily the nicotine that's most important, but the bioavailability of that nicotine. How much can the user consume? So if all these products are so similar, why do we take the time to distinguish between them? Well, there's a lot of reasons. For obvious reasons, it's important to understand what's going on here so that we can talk to our clients. Another important point is that many people do follow a sort of a standard progression through these devices, where they might begin with a basic e-cigarette and move forward to more advanced types of these devices as time goes on. Through this process, they may solidify their identity and may perpetuate ongoing use. Again, people often start with the basic e-cigarette, which is fairly familiar, kind of similar to a traditional cigarette. From there, they may move to a vape pen, which uses e-juice and contains interchangeable parts, a system sometimes called EGO. So these vape pens have tanks that hold different concentrations of nicotine. We commonly see 6, 12, 18, and 24 milligrams of nicotine and 1 to 2 milliliter juice solution within the tank. And in order to give you an understanding about how much nicotine that is compared to cigarettes, the 24 milligram concentration would be close to a pack of cigarettes. You can see we also have mods, the modifiable systems. And these are devices that have large tanks and allow the individual user to, as the name would imply, to modify them. This also allows for tricks to be performed with these devices, as you may have seen. The dripping technique, as it's commonly referred to, is a technique of dripping juice directly on the coil within the device. Users report that may result in better hit and more intense flavor, but it may have the unintended consequence of releasing additional carcinogens. That's of particular concern, as we have seen some studies that found that about, it was a 1,000 teen study and found about 26% of those users were experimenting with dipping. And we'll talk about Juul a little bit more in detail later when Jim comes back on the presentation. So here you have 2 slides, and I'm going to start, or 2 pie charts. I'm going to start with the one on the left before I move to the right. The one on the left is a rendering of the population of 3.5% of adults who use ENDS either daily or some days. You can see, looking at this chart, that nearly 2/3 of these individuals are dual users, meaning that they use both an ENDS device and smoke traditional cigarettes. So obviously that's a big portion of this population, and that's of extreme concern, which we'll talk about as we go through, but obviously they're still exposing themselves to cigarette smoke. You can also see that about 30% of these regular users were former smokers, meaning that they had quit cigarettes for over a year, perhaps longer, but now have returned to use. And then finally, you can see that about 11% had never used any type of cigarettes and went directly to ENDS. So there's a lot of concerns as we unpack this. Obviously, when you're dual using, you're not getting the benefit of quitting cigarettes. These former smokers possibly, perhaps likely, would have maintained their abstinence were it not for the invention of ENDS. And then the 11% probably would have never started, or perhaps would have never started if ends weren't available. Okay, now looking to the right, this is a subset of the chart on the left of younger users. You can see 18 to 24 years old. And obviously the chart is a little bit different here. You can see we have few dual users at about 43% there. So while fewer, there's still quite a large number of people who are doing both. And then you can see an equal amount, roughly, of never smokers. So these are people who perhaps never would start using nicotine products if they had not began with ends. And there's a lot of concern here. One of the things that may be happening is we're starting to see more and more stigmatization and denormalization of cigarette use. However, the opposite is becoming true with ends. There's potential for it to become more and more mainstream and more accepted. Another important thing to note here is, as with cigarettes, there's a higher rate of use of all these products among behavioral health and mental illness populations, which obviously can exacerbate those conditions. We do see that rates are rising for ends use in this group, and it's a concern going forward, particularly with dual use and targeting of these individuals by the tobacco industry in mind. Okay, let's talk for a moment about what's in the ends aerosol. And we do use the term aerosol as opposed to vapor. A vapor is a term used to describe liquids that are held in suspension in air. And we use aerosol because there are some tiny solid particulates that are in the aerosol that's released from the ends product. And there are health risks associated with those tiny particulates. They may cause lung and throat irritation, breathing complications. Chronic exposure could lead to more serious problems, respiratory and cardiovascular issues, could worsen things like asthma and COPD. So vapor is the term that the industry uses, as it sounds, much less damaging, potentially harmful, but we really do recommend the term aerosol. The contents of those aerosols depend greatly based on the product, how they're used, the tanks, the device, the e-juice, etc. So a little more complicated as to what's actually in them. One key area of concern that we do want to focus on is propylene glycol or glycerol. This component is used to hold nicotine in suspension in the e-juice and allow for atomization and for also flavor preservation. You can see here that they're deemed generally recognized as safe by the FDA. However, that is for food consumption. These products, or this chemical, can be used to preserve food to lower its freezing temperature, such as with ice cream. But when it's used in ends devices, we're talking about a very different mechanism here. As opposed to eating, we're talking about inhaling these products after they've been combusted. And there's really no robust studies on this measure at all. So the outcome of that is really unknown. Another concern with ends devices is that obviously they do contain nicotine, and we know that nicotine is highly addictive. It has an extremely high capture rate, and there are risks to nicotine in and of itself unrelated to some of the other, the more significant things that can accompany burning a cigarette. It's especially risky for pregnant and nursing mothers as well as their infants. Exposure to nicotine can cause fetal neural problems and lung development issues. We're even finding some studies suggesting that these effects could be intergenerational, as they may damage DNA and therefore pass down some of this damage to future generations. Brain development may be impaired as well. So it's important to make sure that ends users realize that nicotine in and of itself is not harmless, especially moms and nursing mothers. So when we're thinking about harm reduction versus the risks of addiction and habit forming and the other risks, it's important to keep this component in mind. So let's go back to the ends aerosol topic now. You can see there's other compounds that do exist in the ends aerosol, a lot of heavy metals, as you can see there. And while the press focuses on things like exploding devices and toxicity related to drinking e-juice and things like that, these compounds really are the greater risk overall. metals can be available in some of the cheaper products, particularly those that come from China. And although these are in small amounts, it may be a low risk. We're not really sure. There's a lot of research that still needs to be done on this topic, but nevertheless, we are exposing ourselves to these compounds and chemicals. And similarly to propylene glycol, we just don't know about the process of inhalation of these chemicals in terms of what it can do to the body and the lungs. So looking at secondhand emissions from ENDS devices, again, this is, you see we use the term here, secondhand vapor, but it could also be secondhand aerosols, because of course it does have the same particulate matter. Obviously the secondhand vapor will contain nicotine and the same heavy metals and toxins that the mainstream inhalation would have. However, secondhand vape does appear to be less harmful than cigarettes. It's probably safer, however, we still need to do more research in order to make that definitive. It doesn't appear that there's a strong inflammatory response, whereas secondhand smoke from cigarettes can produce a more profound effect. So in short, in summary, ENDS are most likely safer than cigarettes. We presume that they are, yet we cannot say definitively, as we do not have any studies on long-term use. That obviously will take a long time in order to research and reveal the findings there. And also of concern is that these devices do maintain an addiction to nicotine. They send a misleading message. They tend to perpetuate dual use, and their long-term impact on youth populations is largely unknown, but obviously we're seeing a great growth in that group there, and that's an area of particular concern. So shifting gears a little bit in the last few minutes on this topic, I want to focus on ENDS as cessation devices. Now, to be clear, no ENDS manufacturers are claiming that their products are true cessation devices, as that would mean additional FDA oversight and regulation and things of that nature. However, obviously, individual users, very public users, of course, and the media all present, or not all, but many present ENDS as a cessation device. So regardless of whether they're formally promoting themselves as such, they are benefiting from this perception in society. What evidence is there that ENDS might be able to help people quit? Well, a lot of user communities do claim that they've used ENDS successfully as a cessation device. Along with other claims, we've seen some pretty outlandish claims such as weight loss remedies and cures for depression. All these things are very speculative at best and would require a lot of extensive research. But thinking of them in these terms can be misleading and dangerous, especially again with our behavioral health populations in mind, as it does perpetuate the use of these products and potentially dual use and exposure to nicotine. Regardless, many adult users do have and do claim to have stopped or reduced their cigarette use using ENDS. However, even so, even if that's true, that's not the case for young people. Many young people who are not adopting these devices after quitting cigarettes are simply taking them up from not having smoked, as we saw in that earlier slide. So research in the US and other countries has investigated this topic about can ENDS help people quit. So what have they found so far? Well, unfortunately, I don't have any definitive answers for you. Quite the opposite. We've seen a lot of mixed results, particularly in comparing NRT to ENDS. NRT being nicotine replacement therapy, your patches and your gums and lozenges and FDA approved things like that that are designed to help people quit smoking. Some studies have found that ENDS were more effective. Others have found that they were not. Many of the studies have found very similar quit rates, and I think that's really the most useful thing to remember. There's a lot of complications in this research. Selection bias is a concern when we're evaluating these, when we're making these comparisons. For one, ENDS users may be more motivated to quit smoking if they're using it for that purpose. They may be more familiar with the instructions, having used cigarettes before, perhaps as compared to NRT. lots of other biases can be in play here, and we're going to need a lot more research in order to make any stronger conclusions. Ultimately, ends may work for some people. However, dual use and addiction remain realities and common outcomes that occur. So another key point to make here is that many people, as we saw, are dual users, meaning that they are still smoking at least some cigarettes in addition to their ends use. And that is problematic because, as you can see here, even minimal exposure to cigarettes is extremely unsafe. In order to achieve a substantial benefit, the cigarette smoker would have to reduce a very extensive amount. You can see there about 90%. Unfortunately, the first cigarette does the most harm, and when people are using ends devices, they're maintaining their addiction to nicotine, and there's going to be situations where they may be compelled or more likely to use cigarettes. And unfortunately, this reality is contrary to popular belief. Many people think that they're doing good if they're able to reduce, say from a pack a day to 3 or 4 cigarettes or something like that, whatever the case may be. However, realistically, the harm reduction that they're getting is very minimal. So as we weigh the benefits and risk of ends devices as a cessation device, in theory, they may be able to help, and perhaps in the future we'll be able to refine our ability to use them as such. However, in practice at the present, they're perpetuating dual use among adults, as we've seen, and they're also driving youth initiation of these products and creating youth addiction to nicotine. So long term, it's going to be hard to it's hard to say long term whether or not these will have a positive or negative impact overall. So as healthcare public health professionals, how do we address ends use? Because like it or not, ends use is growing and is going to be with us for a while. So how do we respond? One thing that we can definitely do is make sure that we're including ends in all of our discussions about cigarettes, as we traditionally do, embedding it in our 5As or AAR methods, if you're familiar with those, and being very specific when we ask people questions and have conversations with people, making sure that we're capturing all the potential devices that they may be using and getting as much information as we can. We do want to listen and consider the user's experience, as our knowledge base in this field is still growing. There's a lot that we can learn from having those conversations, and we can apply them to our discussions with future clients. At the same time, we do want to educate people who are using ends. We want to make sure that we address the misconceptions, make sure that they understand the risks, and we do want to still build their motivation to quit and be able to refer them to the appropriate people to help do that. So as a final thought in this section, what messages do we want to communicate in this regard? We do want to note that these chemicals, these ends devices release aerosols that contain toxins. We want to make sure people understand that they're not harmless, even if we're still refining our knowledge of these products. We want to make sure people understand that they'll need to cut out cigarettes entirely in order to have a benefit from that harm reduction perspective. And we don't want them using ends forever. We do want them to be using them with a quit date in mind or a quit process in mind. Of course, we do want to highlight just how they are not harmless for any pregnant moms or moms with young kids who may be nursing. We want to make sure that we talk about the long-term uncertainty of these products and how we just don't know what the future may hold and what long-term exposure may produce. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jim for a look at pod-based and Juul devices.
Great, thanks again, Derek. So in this final section, I want to talk about pod-based products. And to be sure, I am talking about Juul, but I'm also talking about their competitors like Trap Pods, Warren Air, Aspire Breeze 2, and MyBlue. And there's a bunch of others. Much of what Derek had to say in the 2 previous sections remains applicable to these products. The presence of propylene glycol, for example, and the presence of nicotine, food-grade flavoring products, and the public perception that one of their biggest advantages is that people can use them to quit smoking. But there are a few striking differences that earn them a place on the timeline that I shared at the very beginning of the presentation as the potential gateway into a new era of nicotine dependence. I do want to briefly point out that in addition to the products that we have been calling ENDS, Electronic Nicotine Delivery Systems, there are other products that we aren't discussing today. There are a class of nicotine salt products like Zen, pictured here on the left. Zen contains no tobacco leaf at all and uses a nicotine extract combined with an acid. This formulation is actually pretty similar to what Juul uses, but in this product, it's inside of a pouch, like snus. In fact, this product is made by Swedish Match, the makers of snus. The other two products on this page are Plume and IQOS, respectively. The center product, Plume, is currently a product of Japan Tobacco Inc. and is sold in various global markets. It was originally designed by the people who now make Juul. It is similar to other ENDS products that we've been discussing insofar as it is a vaporizer. The key difference is that the other ENDS vaporize nicotine held in a propylene glycol solution, while Plume vaporizes the nicotine directly from the leaf itself, similarly to the way marijuana vaporizers extract the THC and other chemicals from the marijuana plant material. The product on the far right is IQOS. This uses heat not burn, quote unquote, heat not burn technology. It is a product of Philip Morris International and, like Plume, is popular in global markets. These two products still contain tobacco leaves, and they still put those leaves in the presence of heat. So it is unclear if they are safer, and if so, by how much. At any rate, these products still represent a fraction of total tobacco use, and I'm bringing them up here just so that you can be on the lookout for them in the future, but also to point out that what follows really isn't talking about these products, as very, very little is known about them. They're just not very popular yet. Finally, it isn't considered very often in discussions on this topic, but as we're considering the role of dependence in cigarette alternatives, it is worth pointing out that clinicians should also be helping their clients develop cessation treatment plans for their nicotine replacement therapy. As we've already discussed, nicotine itself, while generally safe for adults, and of course much, much safer than tobacco leaf products, it isn't entirely safe. And it is especially problematic for developing brains, which includes adolescents and young adults. It is especially harmful for babies in utero, for whom it causes not only abnormal brain development, but also impacts lung development and is a leading cause of both underweight births and SIDS in the delivered infant. Also, a nicotine-dependent person, regardless of the form of nicotine, remains at greater risk of relapsing to more efficient forms of delivery, namely cigarettes. So as you'll see, the comparison between the ENDS products and NRT isn't altogether improper for other reasons as well. So as we begin our discussion on why we should differentiate the pod-based products from the ENDS products that came before, we need to understand nicotine a bit and how the cigarette differs from other tobacco products. As previously noted, nicotine is an extremely powerful psychoactive drug. Specifically, it's a euphoriant. That is, it makes people feel good. In fact, delivered intravenously under a researcher's care delivers a more powerful high than cocaine. It is similar to cocaine in many of its effects, and in clinical trials conducted in the 80s and 90s, indistinguishable from cocaine according to research subjects familiar with that drug's effects on them. It is also a performance-enhancing drug that, in a non-dependent individual, it improves attention and heightens focus. With or without the cigarette, nicotine is known to control the behavior of both human and animal subjects in ways easily predicted by any model of addiction. What I want to concentrate on are those features of the cigarette that maximize nicotine's already addictive nature. One critical feature of the cigarette is that the dose delivered is highly modifiable by what tobacco researchers call the puff topography. These include things like how intensely and deeply into the lungs the smoke is inhaled and how long it is held there. It also means the time between puffs and the time between cigarettes. These factors not only allow the user to control how much nicotine they receive through a session, they can even control the effect of the nicotine itself as either an excitatory, focus-enhancing jolt or relaxing, anxiety-reducing calmative. As the opening quote, the quote on the last slide, suggests, the cigarette itself has been engineered, most specifically in its ability to produce smoke, primarily through a particular mix of different varieties of tobacco, but also the nature of the smoke itself, primarily through what's called impact boosting through ammonia chemistry. This allows the smoke from the cigarette to be absorbed through the lungs and delivered to the brain in about 7 to 10 seconds. The nicotine from pipes, cigars, smokeless tobacco, and most forms of NRT is absorbed through the mouth. Snuff and the nicotine nasal spray both deliver nicotine through the nose. The patch delivers nicotine through the skin. The mouth, nose, and skin all offer smaller, slower delivery. As you're all aware, I'm sure, the bigger the reward from an act, the more reinforcing it is. And the closer to the act the reward is, the more reinforcing it is. This is by itself probably enough to make cigarettes the most addictive tobacco product, but it's not just about the volume. A cigar can deliver as much nicotine as an entire pack of cigarettes, but it does so over the course of one long session. The cigarette is used periodically throughout the day. Because nicotine is metabolized rapidly, the receptors are able to resensitize, which allows the user to get several small highs frequently and to regularly experience the discomfort of withdrawal as well. And this in turn helps the formation of a habit. In many ways, Juul is just a regular cigarette or e-cigarette. It began life as an idea born the same year that the first e-cigarette was made commercially available in China in 2003, and the intention was simple: to create a product that would, quote, disrupt big tobacco. While most news stories on this product tend to focus on its aesthetics, like the fact that it looks like a USB port, or its flavors like mango, or its primarily social media-based marketing strategy, these are all elements credited with its popularity among high school students. Juul's real innovation was the nicotine formulation it uses. As we'll see in a moment, this nicotine formulation is why Juul and other similar products may soon lead us to the age of alternatives when previous attempts have failed. So now we return to this chart that I shared at the beginning of the presentation, but to which I've added these light blue bars. These are the statistics for ever users. Anybody who has tried an e-cigarette but then did not continue on to become a regular user. I'm arguing that a lot of people that have tried ends have either relapsed back to cigarettes, or they've been able to transition away from nicotine altogether. The likely more addicted nicotine formulation in pods may increase the number of people in those light blue squares turning into people in those dark blue squares, continual everyday users. And now we're going to explain why that is the case. So how does a cigarette compare in purely pharmacokinetic terms to other nicotine delivery systems? What you're seeing on this chart are two tobacco products, cigarettes and moist snuff, the green and blue lines, and the 5 nicotine replacement varieties. So there's no e-cigarettes here. And as you can see, cigarettes reach their peak after about 5 minutes from the first puff, about the same time as the nasal spray, which is that brown line near the bottom. Snuff, as well as the nicotine gum and lozenge, all reach their peaks after about 30 minutes, and the patch doesn't peak until about 60 or 120 minutes. Now this is an image from the patent that Pax Labs, as Juul was known at the time, filed for what would eventually become Juul. So just to reiterate that point very briefly, this image is not from a peer-reviewed journal. This is a patent filing filed by a company that has an interest in showing that their unique formulation for nicotine results in a unique product for the purposes of filing a patent and eventually making profits off the design described elsewhere in that document. But what is shown in this figure is the plasma nicotine levels for various nicotine formulations, specifically a cigarette, Pall Mall in this case, free-base nicotine like that found in other e-cigarette products, and various nicotine salt formulations. So on this slide, there's no nicotine replacement therapy. What I want to point out first is the free-base line. The type the free-base line is the type of nicotine found in prior versions of ENDS, the type that Derek was talking about. That's this one. Whoops, there we go. You can see, according to Juul, that freebase reaches its peak after about 10 minutes after exposure. This corresponds to user reports and puts the peak somewhere in between the peak delivered by the nasal spray and that which is delivered by the gum or lozenge. The second line to point out is the cigarette line. That's this one. Now, on the previous slide, the cigarette was the top line, outperforming moist snuff and all the NRT. On this slide, you can see that it hits its peak still pretty rapidly, right? It says about 5 minutes, which is what we said on the previous slide. But in that regard, it does so at roughly the same rate as all the other products up there at the top. And you can also see that its performance in terms of concentration is roughly in the middle of that pack. Those other lines are the nicotine salt formulations. So the third most important line on this chart is the 4% benzoate chart. That's this one. This is the type of nicotine formulation that's used in Juul. We can also see that these salt formulations are metabolized at roughly the same rate as cigarettes. So on this point, again, we can see that if this data from Juul is true, that nicotine salt products like Juul are far more similar to cigarettes than they are to the previous versions of e-cigarettes or to any version of nicotine replacement therapy. So the question that we have then is this important? For adults, the most likely outcome here is probably a net positive. In general, and I'm pulling this finding from the National Academy's publication on e-cigarettes from last spring, if every current adult smoker moved to e-cigarettes, the net public health outcome would be a huge win. Probably. In my own opinion, Juul being more addictive than traditional e-cigarettes, that attenuates this public health win a bit because fewer people will eventually move on from their nicotine dependence altogether. From a clinical point of view, for male adults and adult women who are not currently pregnant, nursing, or considering pregnancy, our clinical guidelines remain the same as what Derek already went over. The only nuance I might add is that clinicians who are used to helping clients stop using ends may find that it's harder to help clients quit their pod products. That is, the lower dependence levels that ends users have exhibited to date might not pertain to pod users who are potentially exposing themselves to a much more addictive product. For youth, the story is pretty different. For adults, our treatment outline would consist of getting a dependency measurement and then providing enough NRT to effectively respond to the client's cravings, and then providing them guidance as they step down and eventually off of NRT. To this, we would want to add supportive counseling. But we know that by the age of 18, half of teenage smokers have already tried to quit and failed. This is a pretty clear sign of dependence. However, on our common validated instruments, adolescents regularly show up as either less dependent than their use behavior suggests or not dependent at all. We also know that NRT isn't all that effective in this population. Now, the reasons for both of these things aren't perfectly understood. It's possible that young bodies simply process nicotine differently, and that as a result, some of the measures of dependence, like the frequency and intensity of cravings, simply aren't experienced the same. It could also be that tobacco use patterns are different enough to be substantively different. For example, historically, youth have used regular cigarettes sporadically and in low doses. That is less than 10 cigarettes per week and not every day. However, with these newer products, which can be used anywhere, have a high degree of social acceptance, and deliver nicotine in the way that our most addicted device does, this may be changing the nature of dependence in younger populations. It may continue to be the case that it could be the case that NRT remains ineffective in youth. But it's also possible that the reason NRT wasn't effective before was that previous youth weren't physically dependent on cigarettes the way that NRT is designed to treat, but that they may start to be due to the characteristics of these new products. As previously, a child's doctor always had and continues to have the ability to prescribe NRT off-label. However, care teams considering this option should first consider using a dependence measurement validated in younger populations like the modified Fagerstrom or the Hooked on Nicotine checklist. Scoring as dependent on either of these instruments should not be the only test for whether NRT is prescribed, but rather should be considered the floor for consideration. That is, those registering as low or non-dependent should not have NRT prescribed in the absence of other factors. Those considering prescriptions should still consider the patterns of use and try to determine if the quantity of nicotine exceeds the levels contained in the NRT. Quit plans should first rely on non-medication assisted methods. Finally, if NRT is ultimately recommended, those prescribing or those advising prescribers should be aware that they may be creating the physical dependence that they are hoping to treat. In the adult population, it has been estimated that the abuse potential of NRT, or the abuse liability, is that about 1 to 3% of the population would become victim to that level of addictiveness. This number could be significantly higher among adolescents given the known effect of addictive substances on developing brains. Even with Juul, where there's a lot of social vaping, it could still be the case that physical dependence is more present than in e-cigs, but still not to the minimum level you'd want to surpass to justify an NRT prescription. As with NRT or e-cigs, used for cessation with adults, total nicotine dependence should be the target treatment goal. This is even more true with young people. Youth should be guided toward total abstinence as rapidly as they can and still be successful. And that is going to finish us off for the day. And so we're going to open it up for questions. And again, there's 3 ways to send us your questions. You can chat them in. That may be the easiest for some of you who have that ability. Otherwise, you can raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, we will be able to unmute your line, and you can sort of just speak your question in. Or you can use the Q&A function. It looked like I got a question, but then it went away. So, all right. I'll stop babbling, and you guys can just ask your questions if you have any. Okay, well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm not going to take up any more of your time. If you do end up thinking of, oh, we just have a question coming in as I was wrapping up. Somebody had to type real fast. Lucy says, I am particularly interested in substance users, alcohol and drug dependent smokers, who often say INS devices are really helpful. So they can be. I think the trick here and is this possible population that might be helped? Yes, absolutely. So I'll restate your question, Lucy, and if I'm wrong, you can offer clarification. But so I just want to sort of emphasize what Derek has said and what I hope I said too. Yes, the evidence here is mixed on whether or not these can be a cessation device, whether or not these can sort of take the place of regular cigarettes for whatever reason that somebody is using a cigarette. And the short answer is they can. They can. Here are the real dangers, or the primary dangers. They don't up until Juul, and things may change with pod products, but the previous versions of INS in particular haven't proven very successful in the field, right? Like in a clinical trial, that's where we see like these mixed studies. We'll see that in the clinical trials, e-cigs are about as effective as nicotine replacement therapy. And keeping in mind that that is not a huge win all by itself, right? Nicotine replacement therapy, depending on the study you're looking at, has about a 25 to 30% success rate, which is still 600 times better than trying to quit without NRT, but is still not particularly great. And e-cigs are in that same ballpark. And that makes sense, right? The formulations of nicotine are very similar. The high that people get from e-cigarettes is not as good as they get from an actual cigarette, et cetera. Yeah, so I'll reach that third question there in just a second. So when we were thinking about behavioral change, we have to think about why somebody's using a product, and we never extinguish a behavior, right? We just replace it. And so can an e-cig be that replacement? Yeah. The danger there is that they will not use it entirely. They will not go entirely over to e-cigs. They'll continue dual using. And then if they continue to become lifelong INS users, they remain vulnerable to relapse. So those are the 2 big concerns. So with the proper guidance, potentially. And then for your third question, so Lucy's asked, can they be allowed to use them in residential settings that are tobacco-free? We often give NRT. And that, I would say no. And the reason here is there's a couple reasons. One is these are not an FDA-approved cessation device, no matter what, right? Until they want to send their products through these tests, prove them with the proper documentation and market them that way. These are not an FDA-approved cessation device, and there's a lot of potential dangers here that Derek did a good job, I think, explaining. We don't want any of our healthcare professionals to be in a business, and that's mental health, substance abuse, or regular medical care. We don't want any of them to be in the business of assigning or prescribing or recommending what could potentially be a harmful product, right? Some people may or may not be particularly sensitive to the nickel or the cadmium that are found in some of these products. And we don't want you to be the result of providing somebody long-term brain damage when they might, for whatever reason, be particularly insensitive to the risks of lung cancer and cardiovascular disease, right? So we'd be moving them from a product that would not have killed them to a product that does. And that's not our business. We know that people can be on FDA-approved pharmacotherapy for 20, 30, 40 years and not actually suffer particularly dangerous side effects. There's no mortality figures associated with those. And we have to remember that there are things like nicotine in the secondhand aerosols. So these products can be triggering for people who would rather remain nicotine-free. And then just in general, I think that, it's still a product that has its own smells and odors and other, toxins in that secondhand vapor. We don't want to be encouraging them in residential treatment facilities. When somebody's in residential treatment, we have an opportunity to really encourage and support long-term cessation. And on that point, I think that one of the things we have to remember too is that 65 to 75% of folks who enter residential substance abuse will actually try to make a quit attempt on their own if they're in an environment that supports that. And that includes ENDS users. Most people who move to ENDS, and then when I say most, I'm talking about 80 to 90% of people who move to ENDS, do so with the intent to quit. And so what we really want to do in a residential environment is support that quit attempt and not that transitional moment. Wonderful. Thank you, Lucy. Any other questions? Those are great, Lucy. Thanks again. Okay, once again, I'll give some people some time to type it in while I start to do our sign off here. Our email address is on the screen, that bh.wellness@ucdenver.edu. That goes to our group mailbox here. So there's about 4 of us that man that station. If whoever reads your email is the person who or is not the best person to answer your question, it will get to the right person, and we will definitely get back with you. If we don't know the answer in the hallway, our job here in part is researching and reaching out and finding that answer for you. So by all means, reach out anytime. Thank you also to the Oregon Health Authority and the Transformation Center who invited us here. This is, in case you didn't know, this is the 4th of our 5 webinars, and we have one more coming up, I believe next month, and I wish I'd brought the date with me. But be on the lookout for that. We're going to be talking about sustainability of tobacco-free policy. So if you are among those groups in Oregon that have recently gone tobacco-free or revisiting your tobacco-free policies and procedures right now, the next presentation that we give might be just the thing that you're looking for. I hope that it is. All right, I think I've given everybody enough time to try to get in there. Oh, the webinar is on May 14th. So be on the lookout for that. Thank you, Anona. And we'll say goodbye for now and talk to you all or talk at you guys all pretty soon.